All right, this is kind of stepping back, do an accounting of where I'm at with the fork of Spectral, where I'm at with forking it in preparation for Friday's open office hours coming up in 2 days, but also just generally for my own benefit, where I'm at with it, what work needs to be done, but why am I doing it, and the other dependencies that I have regarding the format and what matters to me as I work to build consensus amongst the community and get others. I have my own needs, so trying to balance that. But for those who aren't familiar, I've forked Spectral, which is from Stoplight, and Stoplight got acquired by SmartBear. So I've forked it under the name Spotlight as a kind of joke, as a poke at SmartBear, because everyone I've ever worked with on Stoplight issues or Spectral issues calls Stoplight Spotlight, and kind of a poke at SmartBear with Swagger and OpenAPI and that confusion. I'm injecting my own confusion into the space. Now, will this be the name? No. That's up to the community, and that's one of the first things on the table. What to call the spec? Now, I'm going to be continuing to build a tool that I will call Spotlight, and a suite of tools that use a forked version of the CLI. Now, it's important to me that the spec is separated from the tool, and that's what I'm most interested in right now. But building out the tools for my own purposes, I'll demonstrate why, but having the spec separate is important. So why are we doing this? It was acquired by SmartBear. SmartBear is notoriously not a good steward of many of the products they own, and that's pretty well known in the space. It's generally abandoned, even though there's been quite a bit of work recently, because I'm guessing they're feeling the heat, but there's quite a backlog. There was a supply chain incident that was brought to my attention, and then they've also put in telemetry into it that is leaving folks concerned. So those were the main things that triggered this, but it's important to me that we get community consensus on where this goes, and that's what I'm working on right now. We have open office hours Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern, and we got Phil Sturgeon, Frank Kilcommons, Jakob, quite a few other people coming, and we're just working to build community consensus. Some of what's important to me, there's a wider roadmap, but the multi-specification and eventually a multi-engine approach, so it lends multiple specs, and Spectral is just one of the engines, but we can use vacuum and others as well. So that's the kind of overview. There's a site here. There's more detail on why. There's overview about what the scope is regarding how it's used, the multiple specifications, ideas on multiple engines, and how we want to invest in education, training, vendor alignment. And there's an opportunity, I think, in Europe, because we have the Dutch and German government using this. And so I went through all of the implementations. There's different engines and products it's embedded in. So there's a list here of implementations. And then I go more in detail into the tooling and the ways that it's used a little bit more deeper. One of the important things on the table is how do we fund this work. So I'm pushing into how do we, where does this live? Does it live in the OpenAPI initiative, in the Linux Foundation? Right now it's just part of API Evangelist and API Commons, which API Commons is where I store all of my schema work, APIs, JSON, a bunch of individual properties, and then I'm starting to build open source tooling, and I'm looking to create a nonprofit organization under this. So it's parked here for right now, but this isn't where it's gonna ultimately land. It doesn't have to. It can, but it doesn't have to. But we need to figure out how we can take donations, how we can take contract money, and how we can pay people like Phil and others to actually do this work. Here's the roadmap, kind of a communication structure for when something's on the roadmap, when it's approved. There's quite a few other things that are already on the table. Arazzo is right on the cusp and should be in there. And then, how do we deal with upstream branches? That's something we got to think about. Removing telemetry and addressing the supply chain. These were kind of ready. I think generally there's consensus, but we'll have to get consensus. Rough consensus is how do we handle the process? How do we name the specification, the wording we use? What's the general process? There should be a conformance suite, and so how does the quality managed? And then runtime portability is part of it. Then there's quite a bit under discussion and other things that have been raised. So I won't go through all of them, but here's a roadmap. And then I've just been documenting my thoughts and different research and other things that I've been doing that impact how I see how things work. Here's where you can get involved. There's 2 issues: tool level or spec level, the roadmap, and then I have a discussion thread. And then I'll add the office hours on here as well, which isn't on here. So that's the general site. You can visit the tooling here is on GitHub. Here's the issues, but there's also a separate site just for the spec. And here's the spec that is actually documented. Here's the JSON schema for the spec. Here's how proposing versioning can be handled. Here's that conformance that I talked about earlier. Here's how governance can actually work and what I learned from OpenAPI, Async, and others, JSON schema, where it lives. That's a big one on the table. And then here's the roadmap for the spec itself, just so we focus on just the spec level, and then where you can contribute. So that's the spec, but all of this is at Spotlight rules and spec.spotlight rules until we find a new home, new name, and all of that for it. So that's that general work on the table. I don't want to own this. I'm kind of pushing it forward in an aggressive manner because it needs it, and people have asked me to, and I know others are concerned about the community aspect, the SmartBear aspect, but I'm hyper focused on Spectral. Now, why am I focused? Well, if you generally search for Spectral rules on Google, you'll see I'm pretty top in talking about it. You see a lot of stuff from me. I've been talking about it for years. I'm heavily invested in it as a spec, but I've started building other sub-specs around it, and I use it to lint OpenAPI and other artifacts. Now, you look at the scope of the artifacts. So this is apis.io, my search engine. My search engine uses it, and I use it to lint all the artifacts that are here. And JSON Structure, Arazzo workflows, MCP, agent cards. I'm even using it for agent skills. And so having it be multi-format is very important to me, and getting it so it's marked down, so agent skills and others, is really critical, really important for me. And then building rule sets for monetization, rate limits, FinOps, OAuth, even GitHub Actions is super important to me. So I'm using it in a multi-protocol way. It's pretty critical that I use it here. My kin score which rates APIs on different facets. Governance is heavily dependent on spectral linting, but the overall process itself is heavily dependent on spectral. So it's foundational for me. And I could easily move where other vendors like IBM, SAP, and others, and just use it under the hood and not contribute and not care. But it's foundational for me, and I need the community to move forward on it. Otherwise, I'm just gonna move forward with it on my own. Now, I've also developed a suite of tools. There's a bunch of rule sets behind here, but that aren't quite ready for prime time. But I have a set of tools that I've developed, so starting with a certification. So when you run a set of rules, so here we have an OpenAPI, we have a set of rules, it gives a certification that it passed, and then you can download the certificate. So this is a certification. It's a web-based tool, but it also runs as an NPM package. So API Commons API certification is a way to certify and share that your API matches this set of rules and is attested as part of it. So this is something I've had folks ask for, and then you can verify it here, make sure it works, and it's been verified. So that's one tool. The next, not API discovery. API governance graph. So based upon your rules, where how does it fit into policies, different rules, different areas, different experiences? How does the rule impact the life cycle? You can see gaps where there's gaps, and generally by experience. So this is a way of start graphing out the coverage of the rules when it comes to operations. So that is the API Commons API governance graph, trying to visualize how rules meet the different business reasons we're doing them. Have a API governance MCP server. So it's just basically an implementation of Spectral as an MCP server. So it's API Commons, API Governance MCP. It's on GitHub, and it's an NPM package that can be deployed to launch an API, so you can actually lint and use that. API reusability. This one isn't specifically Spectral, but it gets at how reusable the different paths and operations are. This fits into a wider governance toolbox. It's API Commons, API reusability, so you can search for many different open APIs and via apis.io or GitHub. You can load them here, and it'll tell you what the overall coverage is as far as reuse across those different operations and paths that you have available. So it's one aspect of governance that's expanding beyond just what Spectral is. Now, I also have an API validator. So this is using Spectral rule sets to lint OpenAPI. But like I said, I use it to lint AsyncAPI, Arazzo, JSON Schema, and I have APIs JSON as well. And then there's different rules you can choose. You can see those results. You can edit the rules. You can save, fork, and you can download all of this work as an API's JSON. So this is API Commons API Validator. This is code first governance. So this is meant to teams who aren't design first to be able to use annotations and other approaches to generate their open API. And this particular one uses Spring Boot to be able to do code first API governance. So governance baseline. So being able to have a set of spectral rules, and then define what the baseline is as far as what's needed. Where do we start? This is the very simplest baseline that can be used across teams, starting with contact, name, description, operation ID. And so this is meant to come up with a baseline set of rules that can be used by a group. Now I also have governance coverage. So how much does this rule set, so you can load up different sets of rules here, you can upload, and it'll tell you coverage by sections for the spec, how many different rules, and generally what the overall coverage. So I have 100% coverage with this rule set, and which rules don't apply, that aren't applied to this rule set. So giving you a coverage score. And again, this is the API Commons coverage. This is a UI, but it can be done as an NPM package. I started evaluating pipelines. So I harvested all the Spectral usage in public GitHub Actions, and came up with this ability to evaluate the pipeline, and came up with a baseline usage and a way of, so I went through 1,000 repos, and I started leaving feedback for groups in there as issues. And I've gotten some people saying, coming back and saying, they've made the fixes. Some saying, hey, submit a pull request, but there's a blueprint for how you should craft your pipeline. And most people aren't doing OAuths. Most people are just default OpenAPI out of the box. But this kind of pushes you to what's next. What can you do? What can you pin the common SHA? Who's owned an owned grounded rule set, separate OAuths, human readable report. So this is aimed at starting to improve the pipeline. So this is the API Commons governance pipeline. And then here's the auditor. So that's the blueprint. This will actually audit it and tell you where. So load a good sample. So it gives you a pipeline, load a bad sample, and it tells you what out of those areas I talked about, which ones you need. So this is an actual governance pipeline auditing tool. This is a scorecard. So if we apply points to each of the rules, what does scoring and points look like when they're applied, and our teams evolving or regressing when it comes to the applying of points. And so this is governance scorecard for API Commons. Here's is a problem I encountered quite often is getting waivers. So we don't want to do that. We don't need to do that, and here's why. And we get a waiver and an exception, and teams have to vouch for this and renew it. And so this is the ability to get governance waivers when it comes to specific rules or policies. And it'll in the pipeline it'll still track this, but it'll overlook it. So that's a common one. Rules federation. This is just me playing around with how do teams. This uses GitHub, and it'll evaluate different repos, and it'll help identify how many rules are being reused, how many are orphaned, used by teams, used in common ways. And I want to start creating a way that teams can communicate around this and actually use issues and use Slack to be able to communicate which rules are being used, which ones are not, which ones are part of the baseline, which ones are being contested, which ones have waivers, when you have different domains involved. So a federated approach to rules management and how it works. Created Ruleset Commons. This is where I'm starting to publish all the rule sets that I've come across, and then I'm starting to create more of them. So there's a suite of them here. These are the most common ones that we found. Things like fire specification, and some are the Italian government, some are me, some are not. And then trying to get in so that there's a Ruleset Commons, people can share those. spec review. So this is actually doing a review on it and actually talking about having a conversation, providing the team feedback on their rule set, how it works, what's changed, and what's evolved over time, and be able to download the review and have this as a kind of checklist for what needs to be done for a team. API Authorization Ruleset. So this is just a rule set I created for OAuth and FAPI, and more just focusing on authorization. This is the OAuth Spectral, and then created the reporting tool. So this runs in your pipeline, and it will create a visual report that runs in your pipeline and shows how things look based upon the execution. Also have a Ruleset Studio, so it allows you to actually work on different rules. So you can load a rule here, gives you an editor, YAML editor, visual editor. You can choose from the different properties, but it's a baseline. You can choose different starter libraries, but it's a rule set building studio guide, allows you to build different rules. And this is more agentic stuff that I'm working on, but not quite ready for prime time or part of this conversation. But how can you build MCP tools and agent skills around this? I don't have the linting part of this in here. But so that shows, like, I have a suite of modular tools that help you with different aspects of what you're needing, purposely keeping them module open source. They can be forked, run locally, but then also many of them operate as an NPM package so that they can be used as part of the regular software development lifecycle rather than just in a UI. But the UIs can be run locally, can be forked as well, and you can choose, what's your priorities, and you want to generate specs. There's a suite of tools, and so I'm invested in this. I've been doing the work over the summer and the last 6 months, but I'm going to keep iterating on these. But I need a solid core, and I need the rule sets to be standalone as part of it. So that's one of my main priorities. But APIs.io and the API kin score is my other commercial foundation. But these open source tools, this commercial solution, depends on the rules being outside of SmartBear, being in a foundation, and then I'll keep iterating on the tools that I'm building. So that's kind of the why I'm doing this, the selfish reason on why I'm doing this, and then hopefully we keep the conversation going with the working group that we have going.